Owning a fried chicken joint wasn't exactly my dream job, but hey, in a small town like Greendale, you take what you can get. Fried chicken smells like success, right? At least that's what I told myself every time I wiped grease off my face after a long shift. I had opened this RFC, Royal Fried Chicken, my knockoff KFC, after years of scrimping and saving. Business was booming, and the aroma of crispy chicken wings filled the air. But little did I know, the scent of success was about to attract something far more unsettling than hungry customers. So, it all started with me staying late to close the restaurant, as usual. I liked to make sure everything was in order, being the responsible owner and all. Could have hired someone to do it, but no. I had to wear that badge of honor. One quiet evening, while I was double-checking the locks, I noticed him. A scruffy-looking guy, standing just across the street, staring right at me through the window. He had this greasy, matted hair, and his eyes, well, his eyes didn't blink. Not once. Now, in a small town like ours, you get your fair share of strange characters, but something about this guy felt different. His gaze didn't just linger, it pierced, sent a shiver down my spine. Probably just a homeless guy, I told myself. No need to panic. But a week later, he was back. Same time, same place, same stare. It was like he had all the time in the world, just watching me close up the shop. I mentioned him to my wife, Carmel, who laughed it off. "You're overthinking it, hun. He's probably hungry. Next time, give him some leftover chicken." Problem solved, I wanted to believe her. But something about the way he watched me felt more deliberate. I wasn't convinced he was there for the chicken. And then came the night I'll never forget. It was a chilly Tuesday evening, and as usual, I was locking up when I heard a rustling sound coming from the alley behind the restaurant. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around slowly, hoping it was just a stray cat or some raccoons rummaging through the trash. But no, it was him. He was standing there, right in the middle of the alley, grinning at me with this wild, manic look on his face. His clothes were filthy, like he'd been rolling around in the mud, and his eyes, those damn eyes, they were wide and shining with a kind of crazy intensity. I froze, my hand still gripping the lock. He stepped closer, his grin growing wider with every step. And then, in the creepiest, raspiest voice I've ever heard, he whispered, "Just the bones. I only need the bones." Bones? What bones? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Before I could even think of a response, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, as if he was never there. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those eyes, that grin, the way he whispered about bones. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Over the next few nights, I started checking the security cameras, and sure enough, there he was, every night after closing. But here's the part that really sent chills down my spine. He wasn't just hanging around, he was rummaging through the trash, and not for leftover chicken like a regular homeless guy might. He was picking through the bones, only the bones. That's when it hit me. He wasn't here for food. He wanted something far creepier, something specific. I decided enough was enough and bought a heavy-duty padlock for the dumpsters. I wasn't about to let some weirdo keep looting my trash. But the next morning, I found the lock smashed to bits. The dumpster had been ransacked, and once again, all the bones were gone. Now I was freaked out. What was this guy doing with all those bones? Was he some kind of sicko with a bone fetish? Was there a black market for chicken bones that I didn't know about? At this point, paranoia set in. I started imagining all sorts of scenarios. Maybe he was making some kind of bone soup, or maybe he was part of some weird cult that worshipped poultry remains. Every time I heard a noise behind the restaurant, I'd jump, half expecting him to pop out of the shadows with a bag full of bones. Then I had an idea. If he wanted bones, I'd make sure there weren't any left for him. That night, after closing, I gathered up all the leftover bones, tossed them into the incinerator, and set it ablaze. I watched as the flames devoured them, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Problem solved, I thought. But the next morning, I walked into the restaurant and my stomach dropped. The back door had been kicked in, the fryer had been tipped over, and grease was splattered all over the walls. And on the wall, in what looked like oil or blood, someone had written, "You can't stop the offering." That was it. I wasn't dealing with this alone anymore. I called the cops. They showed up, took some photos, asked me some questions, and promised to keep an eye out for the guy. A few days later, they found him, lurking in a nearby alley. He didn't resist when they arrested him. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. But here's the kicker. As they dragged him away, he kept screaming about how I'd ruined everything. "You don't understand. The bones, they give eternal life. You ruined it." Yeah, turns out he was just a raving lunatic. No magical bones, no cult. Just a crazy guy with an obsession. But even now, every time I take out the trash at night, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, just in case. Because in a town like Greendale, you never really know who or what might be out there waiting. Working at RFC, Royal Fried Chicken, wasn't exactly the future I had imagined for myself. But hey, when you live in a place like Ridgeway, a small town where excitement comes in the form of a new stop sign, you take what you can get. At least the job helped pay the bills, and I got all the fried chicken I could eat. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for the nightmare that started one quiet Tuesday night. It was near closing time, and I was wiping down the counters, half wishing I could just go home already. The night had been uneventful. Few customers, mostly the same faces. But just as I was about to lock up, the door swung open with a heavy creak. In walked this man, or at least what looked like a man. His clothes were torn and filthy, and his face was smeared with dried blood. He carried something in his hand, a dead chicken. Not a frozen one like we used in the kitchen, but an actual feathered chicken, hanging limp by its neck. I froze, watching as he staggered towards the counter, his eyes rolling around like they couldn't focus on anything. Without saying a word, he slammed the dead bird down on the counter with a sickening thud. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Make 6 burgers with this." I stared at him, my mouth hanging open. Was this guy for real? "Sir, we can't use that. We have our own chicken." I tried to sound calm, but inside I was freaking out. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I swear I saw something dark and twisted lurking in them. "Use it," he growled. "It's mine." My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. Okay, I'll take care of it," I said quickly, not wanting to provoke him any further. I carefully picked up the dead chicken, trying not to gag from the smell, and walked it straight to the dumpster out back. I threw it in and came back to the kitchen, where my coworker, Melissa, was looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "What the hell was that about?" she whispered. No idea, I muttered, trying to shake off the weird feeling crawling up my spine. Let's just make him some regular burgers and get him out of here. We whipped up 6 standard chicken burgers and handed them over. The guy sat by the window, slowly devouring them, occasionally muttering to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but every now and then, he'd glance at me with those wild, bloodshot eyes. When he finally finished, he stood up, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked straight at me. She was Cynthia. Before I could even process that, he was gone, walking out the door as if nothing had happened. I couldn't sleep that night. The name Cynthia echoed in my head. Who was she? Why did he say her name like that? And why the hell did he bring a dead chicken into the restaurant? I tried to convince myself that it was just some random crazy guy, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. A week later, the same guy showed up again. This time he looked even worse, if that was possible. His clothes were drenched in blood, and he carried yet another dead chicken, swinging it casually by its neck like it was a shopping bag. He ordered 5 burgers this time. Same chicken, he muttered, shoving the bird towards me. Once again, I threw it out back and made him his burgers. He ate them silently, muttering under his breath. But as he left, he looked over his shoulder and whispered, "She was Rachel." This was no coincidence. The 3rd time he came in, I decided enough was enough. He ordered 4 burgers, and I watched him like a hawk as he sat by the window, tearing into them one bite at a time. Before he left, he whispered, "She was Pauline." That was it. I had to find out who the hell this guy was and what the hell was going on. So, after my shift, I told Melissa to cover for me, and I followed him. He walked with this strange, jerky motion, like his body didn't quite work right. I kept my distance, staying far enough behind that he wouldn't notice me. He made his way through the empty streets, heading towards the edge of town, where an old, crumbling church stood. I watched as he entered the church and spoke briefly with the old security guard at the door. They laughed and chatted like old friends. That was my chance. I approached the guard, trying to act casual. "Excuse me, do you know that guy?" The guard chuckled. "Oh, you mean Christopher?" "Yeah, poor soul. Used to be a farmer, had a nice family and everything. But then his wife, well, something happened, and he's never been the same." "What happened?" I asked, feeling that familiar chill creep up my spine. The guard shook his head. "No one knows for sure. His wife was found dead in their chicken coop. Some say she had a stroke. Others think it was something worse. But when Christopher came home and saw his chickens pecking at her body, well, something broke in him that day. He hasn't been right since. My blood ran cold. And his kids? Had 6 of them. Haven't seen a few of them in a while, though. Pauline, Rachel, and Cynthia. They used to come by the church sometimes, but not lately." I felt the floor drop out from under me. Those names, Pauline, Rachel, Cynthia, the same ones he'd whispered after eating his burgers. They called the police that night. When they raided his farm, they found 3 of his daughters alive, chained up in the barn, barely surviving. But it took them 3 more days to dig up the bodies of the other 3, Pauline, Rachel, and Cynthia, buried deep in the ground near the chicken coop. Christopher had been killing his daughters one by one, convinced that they needed to suffer the same fate as their mother, to be with her in the afterlife. And the chickens? He fed their remains to the chickens before bringing them to RFC asking for them to be made into burgers. I quit the next day. Couldn't look at a chicken, let alone serve one, ever again. Working at RFC, Royal Fried Chicken, in the heart of sleepy old Covington, wasn't exactly the dream job. But hey, it paid the bills while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. Plus, fried chicken never lets you down, or so I thought. Covington was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, so you can imagine my surprise when I found out that our RFC was supposedly haunted. I mean, I figured it was just something the older employees said to freak out the newbies. People swore the kitchen had weird vibes at night, pots and pans clanging by themselves, fryer bubbling with no one near it. Typical ghost story stuff, right? I wasn't buying it until I saw her. It was a cold, drizzly night, just like any other shift. The dinner rush was over, and I was closing up alone. I'd finished mopping the floors and was about to lock the doors when I noticed something, or rather, someone, out of the corner of my eye. Sitting by the window was a woman, completely out of place. She wore a long coat, her hair perfectly styled, and she was holding an orange umbrella, even though she was indoors. I blinked a few times, trying to remember if I'd locked up all the customers. Had I missed her somehow? My heart raced. I walked over to the door, unlocked it, and stepped inside again to approach her. "Excuse me, ma'am, we're closed," I said. But when I got to the table, she was gone. I was standing there, staring at an empty seat. My stomach dropped. I rushed outside, looked up and down the street, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. Okay, that was weird, I thought. Maybe I was just tired. Or maybe it was one of those harmless, ghostly appearances people always talk about. You know, just your friendly neighborhood spirit. I tried to shake it off, but over the next few nights, things started getting weirder. The kitchen suddenly came to life with sounds at random times, pots crashing to the floor, the walk-in freezer door creaking open, even though I knew I'd shut it. Once, the soda machine started spitting out drinks on its own, drenching the counter in sticky syrup. Each time something happened, I could feel the air around me drop in temperature, like someone was watching me, just waiting for me to notice. But the worst was when I saw her again. It was late, really late, and I was finishing up for the night. I glanced out the window, and there she was, sitting in the exact same spot, holding that same orange umbrella. Only this time, she wasn't just sitting there. She was staring right at me, her eyes locked on mine like she knew something I didn't. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. My brain screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. Her eyes, they had this cold, empty look, like she could see straight through me. And then, just like before, she vanished. Gone, like she was never there. The next day, I decided to confide in Mike, one of the older employees who'd been working at RFC for years. I told him about the woman, the orange umbrella, and all the weird stuff that had been happening. He just stared at me for a second, then burst out laughing. "Congrats, buddy. Looks like you've met Mrs. Margaret." "Who?" I asked, completely confused. "You know, the old owner's wife? The one who disappeared. This whole place used to be a diner back in the day, and she vanished on the grand opening night, never to be seen again," Mike said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through some old articles. "There she is," he said, showing me an old black and white photo. I felt my stomach drop. The woman in the photo was holding an orange umbrella. According to the article, Mrs. Margaret had gone missing the very night her husband opened the diner, and no one had ever found out what happened to her. place had been closed down for years before RFC moved in, and ever since, people had claimed to see strange things, but no one had ever seen her up close. Until now. Mike shrugged. "Look, man, as long as she's not causing trouble, just let her be. She's harmless." Harmless. Harmless didn't explain why she kept staring at me like she knew something I didn't. But still, I figured as long as she didn't start flinging knives or anything, I'd manage. That night, as I closed up, I saw her again. Same spot, same umbrella, same unnerving stare. But this time, something was different. Instead of disappearing like before, she stood up, slowly, and started walking. No, gliding, toward the back of the restaurant. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. Against my better judgment, I followed her, my feet moving on their own. She led me to an old storage room we barely used anymore. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she vanished into thin air. The next day, I told Mike and a few other coworkers what had happened. I wasn't about to go in there alone, so we all grabbed hammers and pried open the back wall of the storage room. What we found inside made my blood run cold. Behind that old, dusty wall was a hidden space, untouched for decades. And there, lying in the corner, was a skeleton wrapped in a tattered coat, still clutching a dusty orange umbrella. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was. Mrs. Margaret had been there all along, hidden away, murdered by her own husband on the night of the diner's grand opening. We never saw her ghost again after that day. But every now and then, when it's raining, I swear I still catch a glimpse of an orange umbrella in the reflection of the window, as if she's just checking to make sure her secret stays buried.